Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. Tony Abbott's made his position clear when it comes to poker machine regulations. The opposition leaders predicted the coalition would rescind the government's proposals to cap gambling losses. Joining me today to discuss this and other issues, we have Labor MP Michael Danby in Melbourne and Liberal MP Ken Wyatt in Perth. Good afternoon to you both.
Hi Ken, hi Julie.
Now, before we get started today, let's hear from Tony Abbott firstly and the man who's pushing these betting limits, Andrew Wilkie.
Well, it's either another gaffe or he doesn't understand the problem, or he does understand it and he doesn't want to do anything about it. I can't believe that about him. In my negotiations after the election in August last year, we spoke at length about the need for poker machine reform, and he made it clear to me at that stage that he too agrees we need genuine poker machine reform in this country.
Well, the point I made last night was that we haven't seen any legislation. It hasn't gone to the shadow cabinet. It hasn't gone to the party room. But I do know my party room. I know the mood of my party. I know the values and principles of my party. And we support more freedom, not less. And we are instinctively resistant to anything that smacks of the nanny state. That's why my prediction is that when the legislation does come before us, if it comes before us, we will resolve to oppose it in opposition and rescind it in government.
That's Tony Abbott there speaking a bit earlier today. So, Ken Wyatt, from what we heard there, Andrew Wilkie says he can't understand Tony Abbott's position here because he's made it clear in the past he supported poker machine reform. So what's happened? Has he changed his mind?
No, look, I think seriously what we're looking at is legislation in this sense is really a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I don't think we've explored the opportunities with clubs around counselling. I used to be a member of two clubs when I lived in Sydney, and I know that what they provide and what they give in the way of support to problem gamblers worked, but I think we could do much more. And legislation doesn't necessarily will achieve that. It'll just be an imposition. That I think there are better and more effective and efficient ways of doing this.
So you mentioned counselling there. That's part of Tony Abbott's policy, that he thinks counselling will work, but all the experts seem to say counselling hasn't worked and has got us to this point we're at now.
Look, I think counselling, there are levels and tiers of counselling. Look, having a background in a couple of major areas, counselling works if it is developed between the parties involved, and in this case industry should be given the opportunity of looking at what works and what doesn't work, and then using counselling as the mechanism to go through this very costly process. At this point I think is inappropriate and inefficient and takes resources away from where it's targeted to, and that is to supporting sporting clubs, certainly supporting the services offered by clubs. And look, we can't be a nanny state all the time.
Michael Danby, bringing you into this discussion, Tony Abbott made those comments at a Clubs New South Wales rally last night. A lot of New South Wales Labor backbenchers are concerned about this. You're in Victoria. Are you worried about this proposal?
Well, I think Tony Abbott and maybe even Ken, if he's a Geelong Cats supporter, should speak to Colin Carter, the president of the successful Geelong Football Club, who says that, you know, this is a problem. They're in the business, but there should be a loss limit. I think it's more complicated than speaking to rallies of the operators of these clubs in New South Wales. There are 100,000 people who are leaving their families in poverty, spending $21,000 average each, and it's like the issue of offshore migration. You can play the politics of this as hard as you like, but the issue still exists. The boats still come.
So are you worried about...
Mr Abbott just can't say no to everything. He's got to actually... What's he going to do about all of these 100,000 people who are leaving their families without food?
Are you worried, though, in your electorate about a backlash from voters because of this?
No, I'm not. As with the opposition to carbon pollution, as with many of the issues that the federal Labor government has put up, I'm sticking with the government's proposals. After all, Julie, this emerged from the Productivity Commission. It's not simply a political proposal. It's something that emerges from an organisation that was invented to take dispassionate and rational views of these kinds of social and economic problems that Australia faces.
Ken Wyatt, we've heard comments from Andrew Wilkie today talking about around 95,000 problem gamblers in this country. Is this all about clubs just trying to protect their profits? I mean, shouldn't we be doing more to help problem gamblers?
Look, I'd prefer to see us do more. I heard Michael's comments, and yes, look, we've got families or we've got individuals that do have this problem. But legislation doesn't solve social problems. They're
but can't it help though? Doesn't it go some of the way? Can't it help here if people have to nominate the amount they're prepared to lose before they start gambling?
No, because if we look at the intervention strategy, there's not legislation around it. It hasn't helped, because I think that often we've got to go to the individual and work much more closely with the individual. And the opposition to the legislation is not just about the legislation. It's about looking for the right options, but also not providing a framework that's going to impact on everybody. We've got to give people choices, and I honestly believe that all Australians do make good choices for themselves and their families. 100,000 is a significant number, but not when you balance it against a population of 25 million. And I would rather see us take other steps first before we even go anywhere near considering the legislation by Andrew Wilkie.
Now, Tony Abbott has been criticised for saying no to a lot of things, the carbon tax, the NBN, for example. This is another one he's vowed to, predicted to rescind. Do you run the risk here, Ken Wyatt, of being seen as being too negative?
No, because I think that when our leader has said no to issues, it has been around certainly well thought out approaches, good alternatives, and the way in which the debate has to occur. The trouble is, in everyday life, people say no, but we never say that they're negative to everything. What they do is they put forward an argument and then argue about that. And Tony, on a couple of issues, has offered the Prime Minister the opportunity of sitting with him and negotiating a position, but that has been declined. So I don't see him as being negative in that sense.
Just finally on this topic, Michael Danby, do you think that you will meet the deadline of May next year that Andrew Wilkie has set down for the government to get these changes through?
I'm not sure about that. I think probably would, Wilkie and Xenophon will go off and talk to Mr Abbott as they've pledged. I mean, they must work on the basis that, a rational argument, the Productivity Commission recommendations have some impact. If we were to apply the principle that, it inconveniences some Australians, is Tony Abbott against seatbelt laws? I mean, what we need to do is to address the fact that there are 100,000 people who are living and their families living in total poverty. What is Tony Abbott going to do about it except say no?
But you think you may not reach that deadline, though? You think you may not reach that May deadline that Andrew Wilkie says is not negotiable?
Well, I'm sure Jenny Macklin, representing the Prime Minister, is working very hard to achieve that. I don't know of the legislative progress with it. If it's up to us, it'll be achieved. But we have to bring. It's a minority government. We have to bring the other independents with us, and preferably the opposition can do something responsible rather than just saying no.
Well, let's move on to another issue now, looking at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. We've seen in the lead-up so far this week that a lot of the focus has been on human rights issues in Sri Lanka and possible violations at the end of the 2009 civil war. Now, the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, is meeting the Sri Lankan President later today. But firstly, let's hear from the Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd.
We simply say very clearly to our friends in Sri Lanka that it is of fundamental importance that the upcoming Reconciliation Commission report deal with the various questions which have now been raised in the UN report on allegations of human rights abuses within Sri Lanka.
The Australian government has been tiptoeing around this issue for too long. Both the Foreign Affairs Minister Kevin Rudd and Prime Minister Julia Gillard have been too soft on this issue. Meanwhile, we've seen Prime Ministers in Canada and Britain move ahead and be much clearer and stronger in expressing their concerns and detailing the action that needs to be taken.
That's the Green Senator Lee Rhiannon there. Michael Danby, is she right? Has the government been too soft on this?
I don't think so at all. The Foreign Minister's been very, very vociferous on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, and I think you can see the success of the Australian government's policy by the drying up of the number of people coming by boat from Sri Lanka. But we have to be remorseless about this. It is totally inappropriate, however, for the foreign policy or immigration policy of Australia to be decided by individuals seeking to apply UN conventions in Australian courts. And in fact, Britain is moving the other way to adopt the Australian system, where the Attorney-General decides whether important international visitors can be arraigned before courts on the basis of violations of human rights. Pursue human rights very strongly, but foreign policy and the relations between countries is a separate issue.
Ken Wyatt, what's your position on this one? Should the government be pushing harder for a war crimes tribunal and further investigations into these allegations of human rights abuses?
Let me say this. I think that Australia's track record in the international arena, where there have been human rights abuses, is that our leaders have maintained contact with those nations in which these allegations have arisen, have continued with the open dialogue, which allows them to also influence the thinking. But the other element to this too is that unless you have those open dialogues, you do not have the type of interactions that you need to make the changes. Look, I think that it is important that our head meets with the heads of other sovereign countries in order not only to deal with those issues, but also leave the door open for discussion that will remedy those, but also in terms of the way in which we do business with those sovereign nations.
So you think that the government here is striking the right balance?
Look, I think and I certainly heard on the news today that the Prime Minister is meeting with the head of Sri Lanka. I think that in terms of the discussion she will have, would not be dissimilar to any other Prime Minister. They will canvass a range of issues, and I have a strong sense that they will also canvass the issue of human rights. It's a right that we take for granted, but in other sovereign nations it sometimes does not occur. And certainly Michael referred to the commission that is looking at the advent outcomes that arise out of conflicts.
Well, Michael, just finally on this subject then, Canada is talking about perhaps a possible boycott of the next CHOGM in 2013 that Sri Lanka is set to host. Do you think Australia should be considering that?
Well, I think the Canadians have set a high bar for the Sri Lankan government to jump over. And whether Australia specifically supports a boycott at this stage, let the Prime Minister have talks with the Sri Lankan President. Let the United Nations and the international community continue its pressure on Sri Lanka. The Tamil people of Sri Lanka have to be treated fairly and justly, and the eyes of the world will be on Sri Lanka in the meantime. And I think actually the pressure of the Commonwealth meeting will have a very good effect on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka.
We'll have to leave it there, Michael. We're about to run out of time. Ken Wyatt, Michael Danby, thank you both very much.
Thanks very much.
And we'll be back with another episode of Capitol Hill at this time tomorrow.